poquito, poquito podcast. Poquito, poquito, poquito podcast. Poquito, poquito podcast.
Hello, I'm Ryan Reyes.
And I'm Ricky Macias.
And I'm Josh, the producer.
Hey.
I'm trying to do it right.
And welcome back to Un Poquito. Today, Dominic is not here.
Surprise, surprise.
Wow.
On my day of all days, we're doing an autism episode, guys. But specifically, I wanted to do something not different, just more direct. I wanted to spend time discussing what people get wrong about autism, the common misconceptions, stuff that by now should have been corrected for the zeitgeist in general, and instead is the constant thing I'm arguing with strangers about. So we're going to get into it. I wanted to start it off by kind of asking, as best as you can describe it, what do you guys think autism is? Josh.
A developmental disability.
That is a boring answer. What do you think that means?
I think it means that your brain has trouble doing things that non-neurodivergent. What do you call them? What do you call non-neurodivergent? You have like a slur for them.
A slur? Allistic?
Allistic, yeah.
It's not a slur.
It sounds like one, dude. Allistic people don't deal with. Did I say the first half of that sentence
I
right?
believe so. I mean, okay, so what it sounds like to me is you don't really know, so you're just being careful.
Well, my sister has autism.
Well, that's why I wanted to know.
Yeah, and she's diagnosed later in life. And I always thought she was weird.
Right.
No, I'm just kidding. I did, but not in a mean way, in a brotherly way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was always the weird one. Everyone always thought I was weird in my family.
You're the only non-autistic one?
Probably, dude. Probably. Knowing my parents. My parents are workaholics. So they mask with their jobs.
Right.
Unlike me.
You're like, I wish I could quit working right now.
yeah, I would. I couldn't give you. I'm sorry. I can't give you like a medical, exact medical definition or anything. And then I'm also not really sure what you're actually asking, because you're asking what I think it is.
Yeah.
I'm still like I've only recently learned about a lot of it. You know what I mean? Because of my sister and because of you, we talk about it a lot here. And then you accused me of it, so I looked into it, and I was like, nah. But yeah, to me, it just seems like a developmental disability that certain things are different. People process things differently, and so there's a group of people who process things way differently than everyone else.
Right.
That's how I make it make sense to me.
I think for me, I think part of me is going to the problem is, even though I've looked into it, I think I'm going to mix it up with ADHD at times.
Yeah.
I think it's, because it's co-occurring a lot in people. So I think maybe that's why I tend to conflate the two at times. But from what this is where, I'll just say what I think it is basically, it's a processing disorder, but it's also the amount of information you're trying to process at one time is a lot more compared to an allistic brain, because allistic brains can be selective about their sensory input.
Right.
And what I believe is autistic brains are picking up everything. For instance, that's why big crowded environments could be a little more stressful for them, because you can't easily tune everyone out around you. For example.
You got closer. I'm just kidding. Imagine I'm grading you too. No, I just genuinely I like having open discussions about it, because one thing I think is really common with non-autistic people is just, and on paper it makes sense, the lack of drive to learn what autism is. Often, because they don't have it themselves or don't have anyone close to them that would sort of drive them to learn more, they just don't. And I feel like a lot of non-autistic people base their understanding on it on passive collected knowledge. They think that they know because they've heard of autism, but all they've heard of is like, you know, random characters that never say they're autistic out loud, but they've been tested, or just like weird depictions in movies, like The Accountant.
To me, before all this, to me, autism is very severe.
Right.
Like severe autism, like where people are incapable of taking care of themselves and like unable to communicate at all.
Well, exactly, and that's part of what I mean is they only know what they remember hearing about it. And I don't think, and this isn't necessarily that it's anyone's fault for not knowing enough, but what I mean is like without something to incentivize them to look into it, they base all of their knowledge on that idea that's pushed towards them. And a lot of it does come from social media, and I think that that's not necessarily intentional. Not to say that we should forgive, you know, the depictions that have been created for the last like 15 years, because some of them are irresponsible and misleading. But something I understand about media as a visual, I almost said spectrum, visual format is like, in order to depict certain things, they have to be blunt and very theatrical.
Yeah.
In order for someone who, you know, for someone to perceive it as it's intended.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think because of that, a lot of people have relied on very blunt, very distinct caricatures of what autism is so that you could recognize immediately that that person is different. Now, I can understand the intent behind that, but I do think it's worth advocating for people to look into it regardless of if they have a personal connection or not, because what ends up happening is so many people for so long think that autism is a specific thing presented a specific way, and anything outside of that doesn't make sense to them. So a lot of people dismiss them. They fight against that idea. They're unwilling to hear the person who's telling them, no, I actually have autism. It's not just how you've seen it, like on Grey's Anatomy. Like, Grey's Anatomy is a particularly good example of tracking people's understanding of autism, because there was a character in, like, I want to say season 3, maybe season 4, that was autistic. She was very blunt. She was very technical about how she described herself. And
I remember her.
And then I want to say maybe 2-3 years ago, I know because my stepmom watches the show over and over again. Like, she'll binge watch it until she's done, and then she'll start over. So about 2 years ago, there was a different character that was autistic, and this kid, like, it was a child, but even in this depiction, this child, like, showed more emotion. This child showed range, and the way they talked about the child was different. It was a lot more open to understanding the perspective of the child, not just what they know about the disorder.
Right. You're saying like humanizing them instead of making them a medical condition.
Exactly, because I think that's the thing about autism is people are so specific about understanding the description of the disorder that they're not in any way taking consideration into the person themselves.
Right, or like how those things manifest in real life.
Yeah, and I think that's why people get things wrong a lot. It's not just with autism. You know, there's similar advocacy for ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, Down syndrome, schizophrenia, where we only go off of usually a character in the past that has one of these things is there for an episode. They're not there to be on the show or stay on the show, so you don't get to understand them as a person. You just see them for what the conflict is of the episode, and then at the end of the episode, things are fixed, so they go away.
Right.
They're just a plot device.
Exactly.
100%, yeah, plot device.
That's the phrase I was looking for, plot device. So that's why I wanted to do this episode. I wanted to discuss a lot of like what I think are misconceptions about autism. Probably starting with the first one that was mentioned, which was that autism is not just nonverbal, no eye contact, no sign of emotion. That is probably the most common description of autism, and a lot of autistic characters, even when they are verbal, even when they are like supposed to be examples of like updated knowledge of autism, they're very restrictive, they're very monotoned, and they are very robotic. And I think that while it's probably difficult to play a character like that when you're an actor, I don't think that that's the same thing as that character being, what's the word? Dynamic, or it's a challenge for a character it's a challenge for an actor to purposefully remove emotion from a character. I do think that's the same thing as them portraying that character well. Like, I'll specifically reference The Accountant. It's a Ben Affleck picture where he plays sort of assassin disguised as an accountant. And the hugest thing about his character is that he has autism. And there's definitely some funny references to what autistic people deal with, but his character, all he does is play it very robotic.
I'm laughing about you calling it a picture.
Oh.
It's like somebody from the 30s.
Have you seen the Ben Affleck picture? He's got the autism.
Sorry.
Yeah. And I wanted to use that one as an example because there's so many people. There's even autistic people that like praise Ben Affleck for his performance. And it's like, I've seen that movie. He does the same thing everyone does with autism. And if anything, he's not trying as hard. And I feel like maybe he hasn't said that about this picture, but he's made jokes about how he doesn't try as hard as an actor and how like you can kind of see his friends give him shit about it as like an inside joke between them. And I'm not saying that Ben Affleck's a bad actor, but I'm saying that him trying in acting is not the same as him trying something new. You know what I mean? Like,
You're like, I'm not saying he's a bad actor, but he wouldn't care if he was one.
yeah, like he does well. I'm a fan of Ben Affleck, but I don't think he did anything different than anyone else would have in that role based on the last 10 years of autistic characters being portrayed.
What do you feel about like the types of roles as like, for instance, I have two movies that come to mind. I Am Sam and What's Eating Gilbert Grape.
So those ones are very commonly associated with autism because of the advocacy and because of, the representation. But that's also a misconception. Those characters don't have autism. They have disabling disorders for sure. And I think that there's a lot of aspects to each character that could be associated with autism, but they didn't have that. I don't remember what the character from I Am Sam has because he's based on a real person. But Gilbert Grape was I can't think of a better term, and I don't want to use the term that everyone associates with it, but he was developmentally challenged. That's not the term. The other term. You know the term.
Is saying that like offensive now?
Which part?
Like developmentally challenged?
No, I was clarifying. Like, I'm purposely not saying the other word because I can't remember the actual term that's used for it. He doesn't have Down syndrome, but he also doesn't have autism. But he is developmentally challenged. The one thing I will say about What's Eating Gilbert Grape is that character. What was his name? It was like Eddie or something.
I forget. Probably Eddie. Yeah.
I haven't seen that movie since I was little.
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
What's specific about that movie to me is that he doesn't have a specific diagnosis. Actually, I actually want to correct myself in saying I can't say that he is or isn't autistic. I can say that he's an example of a very ambiguously developmentally challenged character. It kind of doesn't matter what he has because he just serves as a particular. He's just there to represent a struggle that the main character has to deal with.
Right.
So he kind of doesn't matter as a person.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
How do you feel about like Forrest Gump?
Forrest Gump.
Because that's also like a general. They're not
He's
specific.
another one that's just kind
But
of.
he's from a period of
generally-
time that was like before they even diagnosed that kind of stuff, right?
Well, so there is a sort of diverting path between what everyone knew about disorders and what medicine knew about disorders, because autism's been a thing that's been acknowledged for almost 100 years at least.
Right.
There's research on it going as far back as the 30s.
But
and
getting
then,
someone to take their kid to the doctor to get that.
yeah, that was
diagnosis-
relatively new.
Yeah.
It wasn't non-existent, but part of that was because before hospitals were kind of normalized, doctors came to your home to do that,
Right.
or you take them to a specialist.
Right.
And
And then you also have the thing like in this case where I would assume a lot of parents from the day would be like, "There's nothing wrong with them."
yeah, there's also always been that sort of shielding aura of parents don't want to admit that there's they want to hide it because it's seen as a faux pas to society.
So is it always that? Because sometimes I feel like it's also like a pride thing of nah, I'm not gonna let this limit them or something like that.
I mean, I think that thinking has been a little bit more recent.
Of being like, I'm not gonna get them diagnosed because I don't want them to have
Yeah,
that
I
stigma.
think that the idea has evolved. I do think that originally it was a thing that people just were hoping they wouldn't find out about their kid. And then when people started to convince them, it became more of, the more, I think it's because of those paths aligning with each other, what people knew and what doctors knew, because the more doctors knew, the nicer they were about it. So I think that they had a different approach when trying to convince parents that their kids had something. And because of that, instead of outright trying to hide it, the parents would fight against it because they wanted to prove that their child wasn't different.
Right.
And that's more my opinion about it.
I feel like I've experienced that because when I was little, like I said, I did terrible in school. I didn't pay attention. I literally would do nothing.
Right.
And so they tried to put me in certain classes or give me certain tests to try and be like, oh, he's got this, he's got that, and I would do great on all the tests. You know what I mean? And so I just remember my parents being like they're trying to tell you you're dumb, you're not dumb and stuff like that.
Right.
You know what I mean? Which my parents were very conservative back in those days, so they talked a certain way. But I resonate with that kind of stuff. So I'm like, I don't know how to say it. I don't know how to say that. Where I'm like, nah, dude, nah, we're good. We're gonna do this shit. You know what I mean? I don't know.
No, I think I know what you mean. It's difficult to accept. I would say, and again, this is me speculating. I'm not a parent, especially when you're specifically trying to raise someone, to accept that there's something that might be quote unquote wrong.
Right.
I think it's because they associate wrong with bad. You know what I mean? That's why specifically in the autism community, a lot of people say we're different, not less. It's just different. It's very different. Sometimes it's to a debilitating degree. A lot of times it's to a debilitating degree, but that doesn't mean that there's something wrong necessarily. That just means that we have to deal with something that other people don't.
Right. And I understand that.
It's the way I compare it, this isn't a perfect comparison. This is just to get people to understand what I'm trying to say about this is stick shift versus automatic. Stick shift is a lot more difficult because it's a lot more technical. There's a lot to it to remember and understand. That doesn't mean that it is worse than in auto. It's just more difficult. Speaking on the whole monotone thing. The monotone thing is heavily associated with autism, and it does occur, just not how people recognize it.
Yeah, I've known a few autistic people in my life, and they were very, very dramatic and vocal people.
Yeah.
They're hitting all the notes.
So there's two things about this concept. The first one is a lot of people relate this to autistic people's struggles with communication and understanding. And coupled with that is the misconception that all autistic people struggle with vocalization. A lot of us do, And some of us get over it and some of us don't. Like I was somebody who didn't, I didn't speak until a later stage of my childhood. According to my mom, I didn't speak until I was like 4 or 5. But that is not the deciding factor for whether or not to take a diagnosis seriously. Because, first of all, 61% of autistic people recognized in the United States are vocal. 49% are nonverbal, which means that more than half of us can talk. An even higher percentage of that, at the very least, understand communication. So even if we can't vocalize things, even if there's a different phenomena happening that prevents us from being able to turn things into words, a lot of autistic people learn sign language. A lot of autistic people have boards and signals that they can use to communicate.
I was thinking about sign language earlier when you mentioned that people don't have a need to look into autism, so they just don't.
Yeah.
And I was in my head, I immediately thought of sign language, and I was like, I don't need to talk to anybody who speaks sign language. So me learning sign language would just be me doing some like extra.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I was like, is that bad? Is that bad?
I don't think it's necessarily bad, but that's why I tell people it's like, it's not that anyone's judging you for not learning these things, but putting the effort into learning them there's only a benefit to that. There's no downside to that.
I understand that, especially if I keep relating it to like learning like another language. You know what I mean? There's no downside to it, but also I'm trying to be a good person. You know what I mean? So I don't want someone to think that they're wrong for not doing that, right?
Yeah, and that's why I was being specific. For me, what the issue is not that people aren't trying to understand us. It's that when they know that they don't understand, it is frustrating when we try to explain and they fight us on it. Like I have family members who often when I'm talking about it, they'll stop me and say, well, everyone's a little autistic. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. That was an idea that was created because the testing for autism was based on an old there's a specific quiz that I've shown you guys, the RADS-R test, that any person could request to take. Anyone who takes it is going to have a score on the test. That doesn't mean that they're autistic, but that is, in my opinion, it's like my theory about it. Part of where that misconception comes from is that everyone lands on the spectrum. That combined with how people imagine the spectrum, because it's never been explained properly. Oh, I don't want to say never. I think that when people hear about the spectrum, they think of a very particular image and just go a really long time without being corrected on that image, which is often a grading scale from least to most autistic, because that's how they remember the color scale. Because like if you in elementary schools and even in a lot of art classes, that is how they represent the color spectrum, but that's not what the color spectrum actually looks like. And in the same vein, that's not what the autism spectrum looks like. It's not a scale with two ends. It's a circular depictor of symptoms. There's definitely isolated quadrants, like motor skills, vocalization, understanding, social behavior, learning capacity. I can't remember the term specifically for that section, but like where we land on how easy it is for us to adapt and problem solve, and each of these quadrants has a varying degree of different characteristics in their quadrants, which is why they use a color spectrum as representation in the first place. So the spectrum is a circle, and everyone scores different individual scores in each section of that circle, but everyone has a score. Every autistic person has a score on that spectrum. That does not mean that everyone is on that spectrum. That is a completely separate matter. So autistic people are on the spectrum. Non-autistic people just aren't. That's how that works. It's not everyone. It's just the autistic people.
So there's no part of the spectrum. So if you don't have autism, you're not even in.
There's
not on
no
the spectrum at all.
non-autistic part of the spectrum.
Remember the Bush era after 9/11? They had like the terror alerts. Not everyone's not a little terroristic. Like,
Right.
like
Yeah.
Yeah. It's either an all. It's not. It's you either.
What are the
either
other?
you aren't.
You either are or you
Okay,
aren't.
interesting.
Yeah.
I actually not argued, but like I went to like a rap show thing the other day with some people I know that were throwing it, and they were talking in the back, and one of them said that he's like, "Hey, we're all a little autistic," and he actually said acoustic, and I hate that.
Yeah.
It drives me crazy, and
That's
it just bothers me just because. It's like the craziest thing to me to do with someone else's illness.
That's another thing that
Yeah.
we will get into. Oh, I hate.
Yeah. So he said that, and I was like, nah, you're not really. I was like, that's not how it really works.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like, no, not everyone is on the spectrum. I think what some people are thinking of is, I don't know who started this, but somebody tried to represent the autistic spectrum, but they completely misrepresented what it is. Instead of listing all the traits that are associated with autism, they put all neurodivergencies on a spectrum, and then in the center called that the autism spectrum. And that's not the same thing either. That brings me to another thing. There's a lot of comorbidity with autism and ADHD, but they are not the same thing. There are people that have one that don't have the other. There are autistic people that don't have ADHD, and there are people with ADHD that don't have autism. Now, in recent years, especially with the increase of late diagnoses, there has also been an increase in co-diagnosis, which is why there's a statistic that if you're diagnosed with one, you're 32% more likely to be diagnosed with the other, but that doesn't mean that everyone that has one has both. And I feel like that's also an important thing, not just for non-autistic people, but also for people in the community, because they're spreading misinformation when they are describing autism, but calling it ADHD.
Right.
And that leads to a lot of people, to reference Ricky at the beginning, who confuse one for the other because their symptoms can be similar, but they're for different reasons.
I think that's also why it's a big important fact to not take medical advice from the internet.
Yeah.
Go to a damn doctor, because then there's been so many times I've been on the internet and looked something up and been like,
Right.
oh my god, I have this X, Y, and Z.
I have bone cancer.
Yeah.
That does bring me to another thing that people misunderstand. Self-diagnosis. There's a large debate on the internet about the validity of self-diagnosis. But I think that before we can talk about and judge the people that self-diagnose, we have to understand what exactly that it is that's happening. Because a lot of people, mostly non-autistic people, are under the impression that millennials and later Gen Z are trying to jump on a sort of bandwagon in order to get sympathy and potentially steal resources by claiming something that they don't actually have. This is connected to the idea that everyone's a little bit autistic, and it is a misunderstanding. Nobody's doing that. One person did one thing 3 years ago, and everyone else has used that as an excuse to dismiss everything. They weren't even claiming autism. They were claiming epilepsy. They were lying about it, and now because of that one person, a large chunk of the internet just dismisses anybody with any neurodivergency.
Sorry.
It's interesting because I've seen businesses do the same thing. They're like, hey, this one type of person used to do this, so now there's a rule that affects all of you.
Right.
Because we didn't like this one type of person.
Exactly. And it's like sometimes that's an overcorrection. I do think people should be wary about just claiming things before they understand them. But I do think that the advocacy for acknowledging self-diagnosis is specifically acknowledging that there's some people that find difficulty in getting a diagnosis because they've gone so long without resources. So they've had to learn to cope on their own. Even me, now the statistics are way higher. But when I was getting diagnosed, I was considered late diagnosis because I was 14 or 15. And at that time, most recognized cases of autism were cis white kids between 7 and 12. And that's how it had been for like the decade prior.
I just looked it up right now. It's 2.2% of adults are
Yeah.
diagnosed with autism. That's crazy low.
Yeah. And that's still 0.01% of the entire population as a whole.
Yeah.
And so there's just like stuff that has been misunderstood. And because it's been misunderstood, it's not just what medical doctors have been getting wrong and psychiatric doctors. It's also like going back to the thing when a kid can function for the most part, a parent doesn't always want to admit that there's potentially something happening that he needs help with, because to them that sounds like they're being judged on how well they're doing as a parent, and they're probably doing a really good job or the best that they can in that circumstance. And so the kid never gets diagnosed.
And sometimes I have been liking this new wave of people being like, it wasn't my parents' fault. Really, they're just doing the best they can. Like the best they can for parent vibes has been pretty tough. I've been hearing a lot of people say that. And I've been kind of fucking with that because people are just people, you know what I mean? Your parents, this is their first time too.
Yeah.
They don't know what to do. And not to be like, there's different cases of different stuff. Some people
For
suck,
sure.
you know
But
what
I
mean?
know what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like it might be like a natural, you know, when like when you're driving and the person who's driving is like starting to fall asleep and you're like, are you falling asleep? And they're like, nah. You know what I'm talking about? I
Yeah.
feel like it's like one of those kind of things where you're like, it's a natural, when we were cavemen, falling asleep could get you killed. And so like you have a thing in you that's like, don't admit you were tired. Like you weren't tired. You know what I mean? I feel like there's like that for like the same thing of like, no, there's nothing wrong with them. Like we're strong.
That's funny. I think I see
Yeah.
what you're saying.
You know what I mean?
I never thought about it that way, but like, yeah, that makes sense.
I'm like, it's not their fault. There's just like a thing in their brain making them be like, I'm not tired.
It's just now I'm imagining a caveman parent be like, I give you cave.
Yeah,
I give you
I
meat.
put cave over your head.
That's really funny.
You didn't even build this. You're not even my real cave dad.
You're not real, father.
You're not real, father.
You're not real ooga booga.
That does remind me of this small speculative fact that some people theorize that autism was a naturally occurring divergence in humans because of. It all started with this cave painting that they discovered was painted on ridges specifically so that when light flickers, the images move. And someone speculated that the kind of focus that would be required to diligently complete something like that is reminiscent of somebody hyper-focusing with autism. Like, they're ignoring that they're cold, they're ignoring that they're not eating, they're doing the task until it gets done because it's something that they want to get done.
And it was a picture of somebody counting a bunch of toothpicks. Sorry.
So you're saying all animators are autistic?
No, I'm not saying that. And that's another thing that we can get into. That's part of why people are... another thing that adds to this idea that people are just claiming bandwagons for the sake of claiming is there's some very unfortunately toxic creators that are spreading misinformation. There's a lot of people who identify heavily with the autism diagnosis or are specifically diagnosed autism that relate to other people that are in the same fields as them. So how they correlate that is a lot of people in that field are autistic, maybe most of them. So they start telling everyone that they think that, and then it spreads the idea that I don't think it spreads the idea that most people in that field are autistic. I think it spreads the idea that people are bandwagoning.
That's funny. It's like if a bunch of autistic people became millionaires and then they're all like, autistic people be all like, and then there's just like rich.
Yeah.
And they're like, autistic people are rich. You know, rich autistic people.
Yeah.
All autistic people are Elon Musk.
Yeah.
That guy sucks.
And might be, do you think that guy's autistic? Or like, what about like Facebook dude?
He's stated that he's been diagnosed, but
What-
he calls it Asperger, which is a whole other thing that we'll get into.
Right.
Well, very apartheid vibes, huh?
I want to specifically reference, I don't remember her last name, but she's a very big creator. Most of the autistic people that follow me are going to know who I'm talking about. Her name's Paige. She's a blonde, blue-eyed white woman, which says a lot about her influence on the internet. She made a video that was defending Jojo Siwa Jojo Siwa has been saying some not necessarily out of pocket shit, but just she thinks very highly of herself right
Did
now.
you see that picture of her that just came out?
I've seen a few different ones.
She's like in her goth era now. She's like in her goth phase.
Yeah, she's been saying a lot of stuff, and people have been kind of making fun of her for it.
Yeah.
And this lady was coming to her defense, but specifically, she was saying, "I don't like that people are making fun of Jojo Siwa because there's a good chance that she's autistic." And
There's a
she's
good
basing
chance.
and
That's funny.
that's based on nothing. That's based on Jojo Siwa as a dancer who like. Jojo Siwa has a very specific circumstance that I think could be speculated at, but can't be, said for sure unless someone from,
no, I totally understand.
without evidence. But like, she spent the last 90% of her childhood being in cameras, being a dancer, being an influence in the zeitgeist, and now she's like in her 20s. Like she's just barely hitting adulthood for the first time. It's like, I don't think she's autistic. I think she's just not 23 yet. Like she's saying stupid shit because young people say stupid shit.
Facts.
Yeah, that's facts. Yeah.
And then this other person is just like, I was gonna say, it's kind of like that joke you have where your friend did something and your mom was like, I think they're autistic.
Yeah.
And it's like they just did something
very
random,
much
and like just if you do something random or different doesn't make you autistic.
Yeah. It's
Also,
like,
I think you're being mean to autistic people right now.
Yeah. Like we don't claim her type.
yeah. Because I want to be clear, I have no issues with JoJo Siwa, but I do think a lot of stuff she's saying is silly.
Right.
You know what I mean? Someone made a video pointing out that her look in her music video, her most recent one that everyone's talking about, looked very influenced by Kiss. And then she, in an interview, was referencing all of these old people that were popular around the time of Kiss. But she said that she has no idea who Gene Simmons is.
She's like,
Yeah,
I don't even know Jeannie
It
Simmons.
that could be bullshit. But also, isn't it another thing to point back to young people? Like to me, like that's just such a normal thing. Like you consume a music, you consume a media, no matter what art form you like, you consume it, you enjoy it, you appreciate it, and then you start to get a little bit older out of your teen years, and you're like, and you start to find out, oh, there's things from the past that influenced what I liked, and then you take a dive backwards, and that's very normal in my opinion.
And it doesn't always happen to people. Some people
Yeah.
just never know. They just never take that dive back.
Yeah. I was just thinking, because a lot of... earlier what I said was like, it's not that her stuff's out of pocket. It's like, if anything, it's more like she has a hole in her pocket and just shit just keeps slipping out.
It's funny.
But yeah, young people, who hasn't said some really dumb stuff?
Young people
Right.
are young people.
Yeah, for sure. You don't know.
And I'm not saying that she might not be. Maybe she is. But I'm saying that if you're basing it entirely on how she's acting now, it's like, no, she's just like a famous person with some level of like freedom for the first time.
And at a young age, it's hard to understand the world and like how your words travel when you have influence.
Yeah,
and
for me,
stuff like that.
the funniest thing was when she said that she invented a new kind of pop called gay pop. And it's like, where have you been?
Yeah, I saw that. That's why I was like, I didn't expect myself to be defending JoJo Siwa, but yeah, I saw that TikTok where someone was like showing all the gay pop icons, like Freddie
that's
Mercury,
funny.
My favorite
Prince,
thing-
David Bowie,
Oh, I thought it was a candy. Sorry.
That's hilarious.
a soda.
That's only at bachelorette parties.
It's a fruity soda.
But
Oh, yeah, it is.
my favorite thing was that Tegan and Sarah stitched her, and they were like, and that's it.
So there's like a fun to be had there, but yeah, it's also like I don't want to become that old person that's just like like shitting on young people just because they said something dumb. Like I've definitely been there.
Yeah.
And it's also cool to say you invented or influenced stuff nowadays, even if you didn't.
It
Look at
looks
Kanye
silly.
West. He said he influenced all the popular music of the last 20 years.
I still, I'll be honest, I can't take that dude seriously. Dude.
I'm just saying it's cool to say that now.
I just think of that picture of his butt being exposed in Venice, and I'm like, come on, dude.
I mean,
You're in a fancy boat.
Venice is the place,
Yeah.
for that kind of behavior.
Oh. Anyway, I think people should be wary of when they claim things. And I'll even cop to, like, sometimes I've done that in the past as well. But I've learned from that. I've corrected myself, and I've made sure to acknowledge, what is accepted fact and what is just like my interpretation of fact and what is just my opinion. There are levels to understanding, and I think that recognizing those levels is important. Oh, I just thought of something. So this is not specifically towards autism. In fact, I would say it's mostly more associated with anxiety disorders like schizophrenia, OCD. Schizophrenia is not an anxiety disorder, but okay. That brings me to another thing that I think is more affiliated with ADHD, as well as other disorders. But as a person who has more than one, I'm going to talk about it anyway. What you're describing as an intrusive thought is not an intrusive thought. I am so frustrated by what everyone, or at least a majority of the internet, thinks is intrusive thought. It is not sudden urges. Just because you're having an urge to do something that isn't appropriate doesn't mean that that's what makes it intrusive. As long as you want to do it, it's not intrusive. What an intrusive thought is an image or idea or urge that is infesting your brain that you don't want to be having. And I will even say, now that we're heavily into the episode, I will give a warning first about the descriptors, but I'm going to be very specific about an example. Let's say that you see a pie on a counter and you have the sudden urge to punch into that pie because of the movie Scary Movie, or throw that pie in someone's face. That is an impulse. That is impulsive thought. Let's say...
Do we all think of the same movie?
American Pie.
American
Everyone
Pie.
thought of it. Yeah. Even that, as inappropriate as it is impulsive thought, not intrusive thought.
Okay. So,
Yes, he's not supposed to do it, but he wants to do it because he's curious about what it feels like. That's what makes it impulsive.
Oh, okay. So that's the impulse.
So let's say that you are regularly eating the pie in a normal circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're like dipping your fork in, you're hearing a sound of the fork diving into the jelly of the pie. And you think that suddenly you start picturing images of like flesh being torn, or like what wet meat sounds like, or you start thinking of like
Ways to kill people.
not necessarily, but yes, you know what I mean. You start. It's not necessarily that you're thinking of you doing it, but you're just imagining it happening all of a sudden, like, you know, or like let's say you're hearing that sound and now you have this urge because your brain is imagining what a fork through somebody's eye feels like. That still has impulse to it, but that's something you don't want to be thinking about. That is intrusive thought.
Are they always violent?
Not necessarily, but kind of, yeah. Like that's the thing. It's not that it's violent. It's that it's a thought you don't want to be having. It's an urge or impulse you don't want.
It's like having the image of your parents having sex in your head.
Kind of, yeah. That would be intrusive.
But like every time you eat a pie.
It's no. That's a good example of intrusive thoughts that people have, whether or not they have a disorder. Because people can have intrusive thoughts, but intrusive thoughts being a constant is what makes it part of a disorder.
Right.
And that correlates with like high anxiety, right?
Yeah, the stress, anxiety, paranoia, things like that. It's heavily evident in disorders that have a high anxiety component.
Interesting.
Maria Bamford used to do a bit about intrusive thought, and I think that she described it very well. And that's kind of why I was talking about. I wasn't specifically referencing her bit, but that's the first thing that I could think of, because she talks about how her intrusive thought was like, she describes it as she has a very particular type of OCD that's unwanted thoughts disorder. I don't know if her descriptors have changed since then. I'm going off of like her old YouTube show that eventually like she did for Funny or Die.
Right.
But she was like, yeah, because I'm thinking about taking my family and killing them and chopping them into little bits and then eating the little bits. And it's like she's thinking of these things, like she doesn't want to do this thing,
Right.
but there's something in her head that's telling her to do it.
And then
To do it or to think it?
Probably
Like
think
the
it.
image is popping in her head.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is like the more you actively fight it, the more it keeps occurring.
Yeah, it
in
is
those
like
disorders.
a quicksand type of
Yeah,
a thing.
that's the ultimate decider between impulsive and intrusive thought, because intrusive thought can have impulses connected to it, but specifically what makes it intrusive is that it's intruding. It's a thought you don't want to be having. It's uncomfortable and it's upsetting. That's what makes it intrusive.
Okay.
And so that's why I reference like, yes, American Pie is very inappropriate, but he wanted to do that.
Because I like the intrusive thoughts meme, which is what you're what you're like, what should I say? Venting about? What's the right
I
word?
think the overall
to
misconception of intrusive and impulsive thought.
Right. I identify with that because there's all kinds of stuff. I always bring up this one lady who would shove her face in bread.
Yeah.
And I always like I was like, I get this. Like there's times where there's like a bunch of bread rolls or something and I just want to mash it. And you're saying
Yeah.
that's impulsive.
That's impulsive. That's connected to
Or like a hometown buffet when they have the giant square of Jell-O and I want to put my hand in the whole thing.
because you want to know what it feels like.
Yeah.
That's impulsive. That's something you want to do, even though you know you're not supposed to do it. That's
Yeah,
the
one thing
difference.
I always had a thing like that, and it's about Jell-O again. Why is Jell-O so involved in this?
I don't know. It feels like
You
flesh.
missed the 50s.
Yeah. Because I remember being young and always wondering what it felt like to just take huge breaths of Jell-O. Of like if you were inside of a pool made of Jell-O, because people. Have you ever heard people being like, "Oh, I'm gonna dive in a pool of Jell-O or pudding or something like that."
I watched that Ed and Eddie episode.
Yeah. There is something like that, and I always just wondered what it would feel like to take in a huge like
To drown?
to like drown in Jell-O essentially, like because it's so
Yeah.
viscous and thick. Like I don't just it just gives me a weird feeling in my head. What's that?
I mean, I think that would still be connected to
To
impulsive.
impulsive?
Yeah.
I think you just played a lot of Minecraft.
For me, what would make it intrusive is like you start thinking like, imagine what it would be to jump into Jell-O, and then you start imagining yourself drowning, physically drowning in Jell-O, and like suffocating, and your eyes bulging from suffocation.
Yeah, no.
All of a sudden, you're scared of your thought.
Okay, so it's a little
That's
both is what
what
you're
makes
saying.
it. No,
Oh,
I'm
wait,
saying
so
like
there's a fear element. What if you're comfortable in the like?
If
Because
you're-
like I make these jokes all the time, which are like Murphy's Law. I call it Murphy's Law. It's like a Murphy's Law running
Right.
joke I have, where it's like the worst thing. I'll always be like, "We die."
you're imagining.
Yeah,
the
you know,
worst
yeah, I
thing.
say that a lot.
Yeah.
That's like a running joke just on my own. I do it all the time, but that's like, what's that? Because like that death is not cool. I mean, wouldn't it be cool with those things happening? I don't want to die.
I think some
Right.
of that is
those thoughts
normal,
do jump into
though.
my head.
I think it's when it becomes like
I just
I
kind of
think
laugh them out.
disruptive, you know?
Yeah, the thing
Okay,
of
okay.
what makes it
It doesn't
intrusive
bother
is
me.
when it starts to make you uncomfortable.
Debilitating.
Not necessarily debilitating, but kind of specifically like it was like how I said it earlier. It's like what makes it intrusive is that you don't want it to be happening.
Right.
And I don't mean just that you don't want the event you're imagining to happen. I mean like you don't want to be thinking about that, but now you can't not think about it. That's what makes it intrusive is it's an urge, thought, or feeling that you don't want to have, but now you can't let it go. It's intruding your brain.
Okay. It's kind of confusing to me because I also have a wild imagination.
Yeah,
And,
that's what I'm
like-
saying. It's like it's also quite common with people with high imagination. But that's what I'm saying because
'Cause, like, I
there's a
think
lot
about
of
this microphone
circumstances where someone could have an intrusive thought. Not all impulsive thought is intrusive.
Right. That's why I was trying to distinguish what impulsive intrusive.
That's what I'm saying.
is.
It's like what makes it an intrusive thought is when it reaches a point where you're now uncomfortable with how you're thinking.
Yeah, because it's like,
Okay.
you know, when you're like on a
bad.
balcony and you're like,
Yeah.
oh, what if I jumped right now, right?
Right.
Like that happens to me sometimes.
Happened
But
a
if
couple
like
days ago.
what if that just kept happening even when you're not near a balcony? Like you just keeps coming into your head over and over. What if I
Yeah,
jumped?
yeah.
What if I jumped? What if I jumped? And it's not, you're not even next to it.
No, yeah, I know.
It's like that joke that I talk about. I will be honest and say that everything that happens after a specific phrase is me making it a joke. But I have this bit about jumping out of the car where I lock the door and I hold on to the thing because it's based on an intrusive thought. I have an urge to open the door and roll out. I know what will happen once
Yeah.
I go out there, and that's the part that scares me. Is imagining like being run over.
I also think that's a part of like a boy thing, like because you've thought that before, right?
Yeah.
Of opening the door and trying to run it, like trying to run.
Yeah, yeah.
I think about that all the time on the freeway.
Well, that's what I mean. It's like, so that's an impulsive thought that a lot of people have.
with my hands.
What makes it an intrusive thought to the point where I have to adjust. So what makes it intrusive thought is the superstition. because now I'm correcting the superstition. I probably won't do that, but just in case, I'm locking the door and I'm keeping my hand away from the handle.
Right.
So now I've adjusted to that
Because
thought
you've gotten
in my
uncomfortable
everyday
with the
life.
thought being so real that it might happen.
Exactly.
It's literally altering his behavior.
Got it.
Because that's the difference is other guys that are having that thought are just imagining, like, imagine if I could
Yeah.
run that fast.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
And it stops there.
I don't want to.
You're-
I
you're
know
not
what's
at-
going to happen.
you're
They
not
don't
at
actually
home
think to test it. Exactly.
hiding the pie from yourself because of what you might do to it.
Yeah. It's when you're so scared that you have to adjust your way of functioning in order to address something that isn't happening, then it becomes paranoia, superstition, and I think that is ultimately like what OCD is it's a personal superstition that you develop.
I could see why it can get confusing for people to conflate these, though, because it seems like minor degrees change what it is.
Yeah, I mean, if
Yeah.
you don't have experience with it, you don't have any like
Because
anything to really juxtapose it because you don't know.
how far into the intrusive thought that you're talking about, where like you can't stop picturing this thing or imagining this thing, does
Yeah.
that get into schizophrenia? Because
If it like stops your day in any way,
You know what
if
I'm
it
saying?
debilitates you, that's what makes it intrusive, and therefore that's what makes it connected to your disorder. If it's not that, if you can go your whole day, if you can have a silly thought about wanting to squish Jello or pie, but still keep walking and function, that was just an impulse. That was something that you craved and wanted to do, whether you did it or not, whether it was appropriate or not. That's the distinction is with intrusive, it's intruding. You don't want to do it. It's to a degree that makes you uncomfortable. It is frustrating seeing people call stuff intrusive thought.
no, that's actually a good clarification. I didn't even know that was. I just thought it was a meme. I didn't even know it was like a real thing.
No,
Yeah.
I've had some bouts of it, I think, like in the past. But that's like also when I was like going like I think I've gone through bouts of it like when I've had like severe mental health problems at times, like where like I've literally had to like calm myself down and be like, don't fight it. Like just like let it it's weird because you have to kind of like let it happen for it to go away. Like I feel like I've had like when I was like especially during the pandemic because I'd always had like a lot of anxiety and I've worked on it and stuff, but during the pandemic and like because it's also a thing that would go off when I'm trying to protect myself or like going through a lot of stress. So during the pandemic, which is like exacerbates the feeling of protecting yourself and like try not to put yourself like it just my brain would loop on the same thoughts and things over and over. Like, yeah. And you have to like let it happen for it to reduce. And also it's like it's a way to reduce anxiety is to try to be more accepting of reality. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, but to me, it just sounds like you're talking about doing drugs.
I think it's important because when miscommunications happen like that, one potential side effect that harms the community it's connected to is it diminishes the actual impact of the latter side of that scale. If you know what I mean? Like if people assume that it's just any impulsive thought, then they're not going to take somebody seriously when they're saying that they are suffering from intrusive thoughts and need help with that. Because they're seeing an intrusive thought as just a quirky little impulse. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like it's something so small that you should be able to control it, and you're not doing it right if you're not controlling it. I think that that's the potential misunderstanding that could happen. And, I could say that I'm speculating on that, but it's also like I've tried to explain my OCD literally even to therapists because when they see on my charts that I was diagnosed with OCD and I seem so calm and regulated when I introduce myself, they are very willing to dismiss that. They try to talk me out of the diagnosis, and I explained to them, I was like, no, I've gone so long with it that I am learning to cope. That doesn't mean it's perfect. You know what I mean? Like look at Howie Mandel. That dude has obsessive compulsive disorder to a debilitating degree, and he's talked about it. He's coped with it a lot more in better years, but it led him to doing things that seemed unusual to everyone else. he's changed, and he talks about it, not all the time, but like you can see it.
But also,
like he can
a lot of the time. Yeah, actually.
Yeah. But
And
like,
also, he hasn't really changed. He still blows up that goddamn glove with his nose.
that's not what.
No, I'm just joking.
But like,
He wasn't changing in ways I wanted him to change.
there was a clip 3 years ago when he was one of the judges on America's Got Talent,
Right.
where the girl singing had a panic attack because of all of, you know what I mean? Like all of the circumstances that are involved in her being on stage in public. She did very well, but as soon as she was done, she was hyperventilating and crying. And he came up and he hugged her. That's something that is hard for him to do. And when I say that, I'm not speculating on his behalf. He's said that in interviews and
Right.
explained like, but it's a thing he's gotten better at.
Yeah.
And I think that's, wonderful. And in fact, he's actually started to become more of an advocate for understanding OCD in recent years. He's literally
Oh, that's cool.
a spokesperson on commercials now.
Oh, yeah. I love Bobby's World.
Nice. Bringing that back to autism specifically, that's why these distinctions are so important to know. And that's why, like, while I don't judge anyone for just not knowing, when a miscommunication comes up and you're being corrected, to be dismissive of that because you don't want to learn, that's what makes it, in my opinion, problematic and
Yeah.
offensive.
Especially when you actually know people in your family. Like, what more incentive do you have to learn about these things when it is in your family? It is in
Right.
your life.
Yeah.
And that's the most frustrating part, I would imagine.
Yeah, because there's a lot of misunderstandings, but like there's a commonality in personality types with autism that they're seen as childlike, but immature and childlike are not the same thing. And I can cop to being an immature person. That does not mean that I have the mind of a child.
Right.
I do think that's why people are always so surprised when I'm able to articulate myself and like show not only that I understand, but that I'm capable of explaining it so that other people understand. That's distracting when you smile like that.
I'm sorry. I can't
gotta
help
say.
it. It's always when you're talking about being able to, you're like, I can.
I have a mental disorder, Josh.
Does mean I can't laugh at you?
I didn't speak
I'm
till I
laughing
was
at you.
5.
I'm laughing at you, not your disorder.
I'm new to it. That's worse. Why would that be your defense? I'm not making fun of you for being disabled, but you're a fucking nerd.
He reads books.
yeah. Dork. I'm making fun of the dorkiness of you, not your autism. I don't
It's
care
all
about
autism.
no, it's not. There's people who aren't autistic and they're dorks.
True. But I am autistic, and therefore that's why I'm dorky.
Oh,
No.
yeah.
No, but that does bring me to another point.
Like you wouldn't be a dork if you didn't have autism.
Probably not. I don't know.
He's just a sports jock.
There's no way. Alternative universe ripped us
You're
shit.
just super buff and you don't care about people.
I'm the new Wolverine. Oh,
You're
that'd
just
be dope.
punking people all the time.
Yeah.
I have great
Turn into a
eyesight.
pumpkin.
Great eyesight.
But that does bring me to another thing. People complain when some people complain when other people are advocates for the things that they're dealing with. And that's frustrating. Specifically with autism. When someone complains that all I talk about is autism, it's like, you don't have to make autism your personality. It's like, but it is. Autism, like how I understand autism is it starts as a processing disorder. Similar to what Ricky was saying at the beginning. And again, this is my interpretation of how it's described. So I want to say, like, if you disagree or you have reasons why I might be wrong about my interpretation, I'm very open to hearing that. But how I understand it now is the autistic brain doesn't know how to decipher what is and is not important information. With a non-autistic brain, I like to use the metaphor like with non-autistic people, it's monkey see, so monkey do. That's how humans learn. It's by watching other humans or through, what is it? It's like genetic code. There's a word for it.
Epigenetics.
Inherited.
Predisposition.
No.
That's
It's
the
like
one I know.
inherited. It's something like inherited muscle memory. I forget the actual term for it, but it's like it's written in our DNA to learn certain instincts because that's how our species has learned to function.
I'm pretty sure it's epigenetics. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like pseudoscience. No, I'm just joking. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, you ever see a goat, like those mountain goats, be born, and they're like, oh, I know to run up this mountain to get away from these predators.
Right,
like,
right,
yeah.
how do you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So that's how neurotypical non-autistic brains naturally learn, is through influence and instinct. With an autistic brain, they don't know what information is important, which is why one of the common traits of an autistic person is sensory overload. Because a brief example is like when you're in public, through years of just adapting to your environment, non-autistic people will know to tune out the coffee maker downstairs, the sirens going by, the people talking when you're in a crowd, and just focus on the task at hand. Sometimes the noise can be overwhelming, and regardless of how well your brain has learned, it can interrupt the conversation. But in general, that's how you function. You know what I mean? Like when it's a regular day, you're just out in public, you've learned to ignore most of the world around you unless it's something important, like street lights, stuff happening right in front of you. An autistic brain doesn't know how to do that, not necessarily. And so because of that, like let's say I'm talking to a non-autistic person, their brain's already doing that, mine isn't. So I'm hyper aware of that environment around me to sometimes a debilitating degree. There's also the opposite of that, which is where hyperfocus comes from, where when we are dedicated to a task, our brains flip the switch. It's like all or none, where we shut out anything that isn't that task. So now nothing's important except the task. So we forget that we're not eating. We're one time I was writing an essay and I was literally like 5 sentences from being done, and this girl threw up right next to me, not on me or near me, just right next to me. And the classroom started to clear. I was ignoring all that. I was ignoring like the smell. I was ignoring, teachers coming in and out. It wasn't until someone actually got me and said, hey, you have to leave, that I realized that everyone in the classroom had already gone, because I was just trying to finish my essay.
Like I was writing bars, baby.
That's interesting to me. I was going to bring up this because, like earlier we mentioned, and I was like, I don't know, sometimes my family does certain things, and I'm like, And now, like, that I hear you talk about it more and I know more about it, like, I see certain things in my family, and I don't want to be the kind of person who's like, are you autistic to everything? You know what I mean? But there's certain things where I'm like, and I make Ryan eyes.
Right.
And I'll be like...
Ryan's always like saying like to people that you might be, and I can never tell if he's trolling or not. Like, maybe that means I am autistic.
The fry squint with the fry squint of like,
yeah.
But there's like certain things, like my mom, like she can't even be in the same room as tinfoil. Yeah. Like it freaks her out and like hurts her teeth. She'll say it hurts her teeth. Those things like always like trigger me to be like, oh wait, that's something I recognize from hearing about all this autism stuff.
Right.
Of like when they say they're hypersensitive to something. But can you be be overstimulated and not be autistic too?
I mean, there's a lot of circumstances that would lead to hyper or hyposensitivity. Hypo is the exact opposite reaction.
Because like in myself, just real quick, in myself, I don't have autism, and I'm not hypersensitive to most things, or I don't get overstimulated by most things. As a matter of fact, I like cramming a lot. I like overstimulating myself. But like hearing somebody chew with their mouth open or something, oh my God, I want to strangle you. You know what I mean? I'm like, dude, knock it off.
I mean, yeah, people have like affinities to things. There's a lot of reasons why someone can have a specific association. So it's not necessarily always autism. But yeah, that does seem like something that's interesting to talk about, because I think sometimes people think that they're overthinking what autism is, and so they dismiss what they're seeing in other people. Often, if you're seeing a lot in family members, you can't say for certain. It's definitely more dangerous to diagnose other people without expertise or context than it is for them to self-diagnose.
For sure.
But there are some things to consider. One of them being, if a child is diagnosed with autism, there's a higher than likely possibility that they inherited it genetically, which means that one or both parents might also show signs of autism, or at the very least, it's just increasingly more likely. It's not guaranteed, but often there will have been signs in other family members down one of the parents' lines or both of the parents' lines.
Interesting.
Yeah, definitely in my family.
Yeah. Like in recent years, a lot of my older relatives have discovered, and older just meaning some, between 5 and 10 years older and even beyond that, have discovered that they're getting late diagnosed or that their kids are also having it. So it's like it's showing up a lot more. So there is a genetic component to it. It's not 100% guaranteed, but it is often statistically more likely.
Is there any links between like people being undiagnosed with autism or even just diagnosed with it, I guess, and like self-isolating? Is there like a self-isolation aspect to it? Where you're like, stop fucking with people? Stop, or like
No.
you remove yourself from...
From what I've noticed for people that talk about this, like on TikTok and stuff like that, when they suffer enough trauma of being misunderstood and not listened to and all this stuff, people sometimes will isolate. I don't think it's because of the autism.
Okay. It's just
but
like
it's because of how they're treated for having autism.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, inherently, and this is something that I talk about a lot more with ADHD, but it applies to divergent people in general, which is like when you don't know what something's called, but you can not. So when someone is different from everyone else, it is at least subconsciously noticeable, and that does impact how that person is treated. And so from both sides, especially if you don't know what it's called or what's happening, you're probably not acknowledging how you're being treated different or how you're treating someone else different. So yeah, like Ricky was saying, that can just be a thing that develops slowly over time where they're introverted because they don't feel comfortable showing themselves to other people.
Okay, I understand.
What's also common from that is the concept of masking, especially in autistic people, where they either pull back or they adapt in order to be accepted. So yeah, there's actually, with a lot of late diagnosed people, there's not in every circumstance, just enough that it's a noticeable phenomena. Sometimes they themselves were the ones bullying other people because they saw that interaction as being accepted as normal, and that's how they hid the fact that they were different from other people.
Yeah, that's where I get tripped up with all of this all the time in my head because I'm that way of being like, nah, bro, I ain't like this. Like this ain't, no, it's not like that. You know what I mean? Everyone has those feelings. You bury them deep down. I have a little bit of that. So
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll be like, wait, hold on. You said what? It's got what symptoms? And I'm like taking notes for later.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, because I've I've been around people, also even worked with people that had neurodivergencies. And to me, I feel like I can understand it enough, at least, to where, that person's not an asshole. They just want to be, they don't want to have to communicate with you, and they want to be left alone, and you're upset by it.
Yeah.
And you're saying they're an asshole. It's like, actually, you are, because you feel like you're entitled to their space and their energy and all that jazz.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
And then I was like, yeah, that coworker's cool with me. You know why? I leave them alone.
Yeah.
I just only ask them about the job. I don't make them perform for me.
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, don't be sorry. No, yeah.
No, yeah, that makes sense. It's a thing. And that's part of why I think that not understanding is not the issue. It's when you are specifically striving to disagree. That's the difference. Like even in that circumstance, maybe that person's autistic or maybe not in his hypothetical. The other guy doesn't know. He just knows that person doesn't interact the way everyone else does. So he adjusted how he interacts with that person.
Right.
And that goes back to this thing of I get it. When it's not something that's directly affecting you, you don't see the purpose in adapting to it. But that's part of what I'm saying is it's not that you choosing not to is an issue. It's that when it does end up affecting the interaction between the two, I think that it can only be beneficial.
And you're talking about the people who are they're normal, they seem normal kind of attitude.
I mean, there's different circumstances.
Yeah.
That's one of them. It also makes it hard to to feel accepted when you're trying to be vocal about it, and someone's like, "Well, you're vocalizing it," which makes it sound like you're, you know what I mean? Like someone, it's a common thing with people with low, what's it called?
Emotional intelligence.
No.
Testosterone.
Support.
When you
needs?
try to guess, all you're doing is distracting me. I have ADHD.
Sorry.
I'm trying to figure out what I mean. You can't give me variables.
I thought you were gonna say vegetables.
I eat my vegetables. I eat too much of them. That's right. You can get fat from eating vegetables.
You can. It's true.
Look at it. No, I'm just kidding. Something common with people with low support needs, meaning people that for the most part have learned to cope and at least to some degree function similarly to everyone else, that they're easily dismissed because you can't perceive the things that are more apparent in people with higher support needs.
Oh.
And it leads to, that's what I mean. It's like where it does harm people, where it does affect how you're interacting is like that you're preventing yourself from understanding these people that you're running into and meeting. We're still a small percentage of the overall population, but we're prevalent enough that in certain circles and circumstances, you're running into us a lot. Especially like online, I think that there's a thing. I think another thing that leads to that idea that everyone's autistic is when you start seeing groups of autistic people pop up, and it's hard to keep it into context that that's only happening because of a technological algorithm.
Yeah.
Like autistic people are finding each other because a robot is finding them for us.
Yeah.
Like the same way anyone can find a group, especially on apps like TikTok, like soccer players find other soccer players if that's all that they look into.
I've been making that joke about Mexicans have a large online presence,
Right.
but like other subcategories of Latinos they don't always have huge populations here in like the States and stuff. When you fall into like I'm half Ecuadorian, when you fall into like that algorithm, I was making fun of somebody from El Salvador because they're being like, everyone wants to be El Salvadoran now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, nah, dude, I literally see nothing about El Salvadorans. Like, it's just your algorithm because you look up El Salvador stuff and a bunch of El Salvadorian stuff keeps coming up for you. And you're like, everyone's talking about El Salvador. Everyone's talking about it. But the computer's just feeding you something.
Yeah, it's like with my profile and algorithm, if you were to watch my videos and the people that I'm talking to, the people that get suggested when you follow me, you might misinterpret it as, oh, well, see, look at all of these people that suddenly have autism. It's like, no, when you put that into the context of the surrounding population, most of my mutuals, first of all, it's only like 10% of my overall mutuals. Secondly, most of them are spread out. I don't live in the same state as almost any of my mutuals that I know of. And in their own individual circumstances, they only know like 2 or 3 autistic people in person and in real life also. They're surrounded by non-autistic people all the time. All of us are. The reason that we look so large when together is because we're now together. We found each other.
Right. Also, the camera adds 10 pounds.
That didn't make any sense, Josh. You're just calling me fat.
The camera adds 10 points to the RADS test.
All right, now that we're coming to an end, I'm going to address something that you mentioned earlier and I said I would touch on again. I hate people trying to create internet slang. Because for me, it's just opportunities for people to make fun of us. Specifically, I hate 2 terms that have been created. One of them was created by autistic people for autistic people. And I don't dislike the creators, and I'm not trying to judge people that use this word. I don't like the word because immediately I knew the association that would be made with it. And that was the word tism. This creator, a year and a half ago, made a video where he said that word and it started to grow. And I remember seeing the video and I know that it was well-meaning. We were trying to create our own word to identify each other. But the second I heard tism, what I heard was an abbreviated version of a medical word, which I think is a common thing in non-autistic people's vernacular. And what I heard instead was all the people that were going to use that as slang to make fun of autistic people. Like I heard the word tism and all I could hear was like a southern stepmom being like, I think he has the tism.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Drinking tea with her other stepmother group
I wouldn't even
groups.
imagine them whispering it. I thought it
just
was
mean,
like
like,
a southern thing, like,
with an implied judgmental way, like she's whispering loudly. You know what I mean? Like I mean that I meant it.
to me, it's like a serving tea. He's got a touch of the tism type of a comment.
Yeah,
you know?
like a gossipy type
Yeah.
term.
And now
that
you see
someone
that
would
in
use.
every comment thread.
right, yeah.
Yeah, and at first we were the only ones using it, but eventually it took maybe a year for it to actually start manifesting. But if you can find that original video, you might find my comment where I say, guys, we can't start this word because I'm hearing how it's going to be used. It's a matter of time before, and I gave an example, and sure enough, a year later, that's how it's used predominantly now. The only reason I think it's being used less is because of another word someone created just so their videos wouldn't get flagged. It was
Yeah.
a term created so that the algorithm wouldn't block this word in the future.
That's
Instead
funny.
of saying autistic, they started saying acoustic, and that was so fucking stupid. Oh, it's like the same way people say pew pew instead of gun. It's stupid. It's dumb, and I hate it, and it's lazy.
Yes. But do you think there's something to be said about that? Even though it's kind of negative because it's not the right type of representation, but it does open up the floor for this to be talked about and for more people to know about it that normally wouldn't even think about autism now.
No.
No?
Only specifically because that's not what's happening.
Right.
From what I'm seeing on the most part, instead it's just opening the door for people to make fun of autistic people. One thing that I think is also a common and somewhat intentional, but maybe not like on the forefront, maybe subconsciously intentional, misconception that's created on purpose is anything that's different or weird is now autistic because autism is now a replacement for what used to be the word that rhymes with refarded.
I don't see that. Every time I ever see those things be said, it's always about someone in some hyper niche thing. Or like,
Right.
have you seen that guy who like is an etymologist and he like created his own bird language?
Right.
Like people, some comments I saw on there that made me laugh, but were probably not in the best. Anyways, people would be like, "What flavor of autism is this?" Have you seen people comment that?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's like, I've seen more people relate autism to someone being like a savant type of a comment than I do to them being like what I've seen most autistic, severe autism, which what you were saying.
Well, that brings two things to mind for me. The first thing is I believe it's all about context. Specifically, what I'm talking about is anything we try to do for ourselves eventually gets turned into a meme. And that can be said about anything on the internet. I don't think this is just happening to autistic people, but it is the reason why I usually dislike when new terminology becomes a thing because it is often almost always used against us in a more, in other, because I have seen it be used, acoustic specifically, as a way of just mocking somebody. You thought they were weird or like they were, acting in a way that you would describe as immature. So you called them acoustic to call them weird.
I understand what you're saying, and I'm sure there's examples of that. But again, like what we were talking about earlier, of everyone saying like, "Oh, we're all a little bit autistic." Like, I always see autism being glorified, in like, "Oh, this person's like."
I mean, that was the second part that came to mind was another thing that people do to the autistic community, whether intentionally or not, that I think is potentially harmful, is quantifying it. Creating a system in which you can tell what is good autism and what is bad autism, which is, again, the flavor of autism was meant to imply what is your hyper focus or special interest that
Right.
you've developed. But in in another context, it's being used to say, are you the good kind or the bad kind? Because people do glorify to an extent that I think is like, it doesn't benefit us. It only benefits the people that want to interact with autistic people, where you're quantifying how their autism helps them function for the rest of society.
Yeah.
Like the whole concept of savants to begin with is like, well, he's autistic, which means he technically is somehow wrong but there's this thing that he does better than everyone else, and therefore he's useful.
And it helps society be productive.
Yeah.
Right.
I
And
mean,
then,
the stereotype in my brain is somebody who can't speak or can't do, like, can barely function on his own, but then you put him in front of a piano and they can play any song by ear.
right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like that's also why understanding the spectrums concept is important. It's because another thing, as I said, statistically, there's more speaking autistic people than there is non-speaking, but also there's a higher percentage, whether they speak or not, that understand communication, even if they don't know how to vocalize. Going back to sign language and
Right.
even just using signals and basic responses. Not being able to speak does not inherently mean that you don't understand communication.
For sure.
Yeah,
And that's why those people should also not just outright be dismissed as not being able to function. That's not to
bad.
that's not no I know, but that's why I think that this conversation is important. That's not to say that there aren't people that are not to say invalid, but are so debilitated by their particular circumstances that they can't function without physical aid.
Yeah.
That is a thing. But what I am saying is that's why we're adjusting terms like high and low functioning. High and low functioning was a quantifying term that was created by a dude who supported the Nazis. And I do talk about this a lot, which is why I saved it for the end. But this is a reminder to people. The reason that Asperger is not accepted as a diagnosis in the US is because it was determined that there's no differentiating between Asperger's and autism. People that were diagnosed with Asperger's are autistic. It is autism. It's just an example of autism where those people learned to cope more than the people that couldn't, which is why, even though it's still a term used, it is no longer in the DSM-5. There's no criteria for it. Being diagnosed Asperger is honestly very arbitrary because at different stages of my development, I could have been considered Asperger or I could have been considered low functioning because of things like not knowing how to speak. I had this thing when I was in kindergarten where when I wrote words, I only understood them if I was writing them backwards, which looked like I didn't understand at all to other people because they weren't reading my paper. They just read the wrong symbols in the wrong order. So some people thought that I didn't know how to write or read.
But you didn't.
Yeah.
Know how to write.
Eventually we figured, this is a whole other story behind that. And that was also just like one small example.
Right.
But what I mean is that's why understanding the terms, that's why adjusting the terms so that people understand what's actually happening is important. A lot of people are clinging to Asperger and they're clinging to high and low functioning. And the reason that those have been adjusted is so that you can specifically adjust how you interact with autism. I kind of briefly touched on it earlier. Like I've been using this term a lot without explaining it, but instead of high and low functioning, what's being used now is high and low support needs. So it sounds like it's being flipped, but that's intentional so that you understand. I am someone who's considered low support needs. What that means is that for the most part, I have a level of functioning that I understand problem solving. I understand procedure. And because of that, I am capable, even if I still struggle, of adapting. That does not dismiss that I have struggles. That just means that I am able to cope more than someone of a higher support need level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I get that. I remember watching this documentary a long time ago about this girl who was basically nonverbal, and the parents even talked about how they would talk about her as if she wasn't even there because they never really understood.
Right.
This is like 15 years ago, maybe I watched this documentary, and they used to talk about her like she wasn't even there, like she wasn't even a person. And then they started figuring out that she could communicate through like a tablet and stuff like that. Like she wouldn't write or speak, but then she started communicating through that. And then there was the guy that was helping, and it was part of the documentary. He started talking about his son, and then she's like, "Oh, he has a son. Is he cute?"
Yeah, like you're going to hell. Heathen.
But like, you know, she was nonverbal. They
That's
assumed
crazy.
she did not have the capacity to
Right.
communicate
Exactly.
or know what she likes or anything like that, right? And then she's like, actually, is that boy cute? And that boy came around, she got nervous. She got like shy and nervous, like
that's so
just
funny.
like any other teenage girl
Yeah,
would have.
yeah. It's like that show, Speechless. Did you watch Speechless?
No.
There was a show about a boy in a wheelchair and he was unable to communicate, but they gave him like a little laser and he had a board and like he would talk through that and like he would point at what he was saying basically and they would read it for him. It's actually a really good show. I loved it.
Yeah, and that's why, like, I even referenced it earlier when describing the spectrum. Communication and motor functioning are two separate categories
Right.
because they're not exclusively connected.
Nope. Your motor part of your brain and your speech part of your brain are separate.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that understanding that is important because it prevents what is, you know, commonly misunderstood. All of this is to say, like, it's important to understand how this works and how to interact with it because that will change how it is depicted, which overall further influences how it's understood. Because without these corrections, without this understanding and context, it's very easy to just accept at face value what's being put in front of you.
Right.
Like Ben Affleck, like The Good Doctor, Atypical, fucking even Sheldon Cooper.
Yeah.
Cooper. I said Cougar. Even Sheldon Cooper is like, it's someone that, it's a character that was written with the understanding that this difference exists, but they still were careful not to fully accept it or learn more about it in order to influence how to depict it properly.
That's kind of what makes Abed a great character from Community. Like, I don't think he was written to be autistic
Yeah.
originally.
Ovid is a very specific circumstance that actually leads to a theory that I have that some of the better representation of autism has been characters that have been written unknowingly autistic.
Yeah.
I don't want to say specifically that they were meant to be autistic or that they are autistic coded. I mean that there are characters that are based on people that the writer knew in real life, or sometimes based on the writer themselves, that unintentionally meet the criteria for autism, or at the very least show traits and symptoms that can be connected to autism. And the reason that those characters, I think, are better representation than the ones that are intentionally autistic is because there's subconscious understanding there. They're not focusing on the literal description because they're not trying to make this person autistic. They're just trying to create a character that they were fond of. And so because of that, this character seems genuine. Some examples that I think are good examples are like Elliot Reed from Scrubs. I don't think she was intentionally written autistic, but when you look at the show in its entirety and the traits that she exhibited, some of it is explained away that she is white and rich and therefore automatically ambiguous, or oblivious, not ambiguous. But there's some specific things that even for a rich white girl, like it's funny that she doesn't understand. And not to say that should be a common thing or that's mocked, but I'm saying that it's funny because it's genuine, because it's innocent, because it feels real. She literally doesn't understand, but she wants to understand. Like her understanding of sexuality, her understanding of how people interact, she has hyper focuses. Like there's a lot of things in that character that under the guise of autism would make sense. That doesn't necessarily mean that's how she's written. But if you told me this character was autistic, I think that she's a better example of autism than I forget the actor's name, but literally than people that are specifically meant to look autistic, like Atypical and The Good Doctor. Those are very literal interpretations based on the oldest stereotype of autism, which is a cis white male. There are good examples of intentionally autistic characters, but it's all about the circumstances surrounding that. Whether someone's autistic because it's interesting or whether it's someone who's autistic because that's just representative of that demographic is different. Like there's a show called It Will Get Better, something like that.
Oh, I think you've mentioned it before.
The short of it is this dude had a kid from a previous marriage. That kid moves in to live with his mom in Australia. He grows up or the years pass. He remarries, has 2 new daughters, and then he passes away. So the Australian son is charged with raising the daughters because also the moms have passed in recent years. And so it's an example. It's, coming of age story, but it's also an example of one of the characters is autistic and played by an autistic actress. And the main character, I believe, later finds out in the show that he has autism. And I think his actor is also autistic in real life. And I think that is miles different from, I keep referencing them, but it's because they're so annoying to bring up. Everyone tells me about these shows. Then The Good Doctor. And in fact, the girl with autism on the first show recently has joined the cast of The Good Doctor, and I think that's hilarious because now you're going to see an example of somebody whose character is autistic and they're played by an autistic person with full knowledge of their autism versus somebody who's interpreting it or being given a script and basing his interactions on however the fuck he learned how to play autistic people.
Just looking up clips of autism or something.
Yeah.
Method acting for autism.
Yeah.
Which is weird.
And I think there is a distinction in somebody who studied autistic people versus an autistic actor.
Of course. Especially because the autistic actor will be like, well, I'm autistic and I wouldn't do that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they're like, well, this character's autistic and they would.
And cottage cheese is not an indicator.
Yeah.
Thank God. I got plenty of that.
So, thank you all for listening to that. This is our yearly autism episode.
What'd you say? Like your?
This is our yearly autism.
But I go back to having autism the second we stop rolling, so don't forget about me.
You were masking this whole time?
I exist, and I should be acknowledged. So I have a very particular call to action this week. If you've made it this far, let us know in the comments your favorite autistic character so that I can tell you why it's an incorrect depiction of autism. Anyway, thank you. And from us at Un Poquito, don't fly.